I'm Joyce Mann of the Cloverdale Sculpture Trail. Bryan Vansell joins us for our second conversation with Joe Hawley regarding his 50 years as a sculptor and teacher. The relationship between Joe and Bryan began about 40 years ago. Joe was at San Jose City College, and Bryan a member of the family who owns Mission Clay, a company making underground clay pipes and other construction material. Joe wanted to explore large-scale sculptures, accepted an invitation by Mission Clay to use their industrial equipment to make large-scale terracotta sculptures and elements as part of their art and industry program. Joe and Bryan, reminisce for us about those 40 years.
Hi, Joe.
Hi, Bryan. I brought a couple of props here, and one of them is this here. Are we getting this on camera?
Got it.
Yes.
Okay. This is it looks like a donut, and so that's why it's here. And so I learned how to make these on the wheel to begin with, and later I added color and so forth. This happens to be a version of that form that came in the toy world later, and I added some color to it. But this is kind of where it began with me back at San Jose City College, which was my first teaching gig. A little before I met Bryan, but there were a group of my students that were very important to me. David Coroca, David Bottini, both sculptors in their materials, and others. Bob Strini. Bob Strini was one who picked up this image too, this element. He used it in a lot of his work, and he introduced Coroca and I to the notion of painting clay. Now, I was a purist in the old days, which you didn't paint clay. Dr. Sanders from San Jose State taught me that you never paint clay, you glaze it. You want something that's going to last longer than paint, you know. But anyway, Bob Strini came into the class one day to a critique, and he had been painting a hot rod, you know, back San Jose's at Cartown. And so he came in with this painted pot, a bunch of metal flake, streamlined baby kind of colors on it. And I lectured him that you shouldn't do that. About a week later, I went out and bought a spray gun because I ate my words. And but this form took the donut, which we didn't call it donuts in those days, and the title has evolved along with science and stars. And so anyway, I just wanted to show this. And then when I just started to discover clay pipe through Mission Clay up in Fremont, Niles, California, to be precise, I got to meet the family and the manager of the plant, which was Ron Poelstra at that time. And I took off because I started getting some pipe extrusions, terracotta tubing. I've kind of changed my vocabulary to refer to clay pipe. This is the little hand extruder that came out. This isn't it, but this is one of their products. And you've brought me a long ways, Bryan, from this little clay piece of tubing, which is a pottery clay. And you can see it's been squeezed out into about a 12-inch, 10-inch square cylinder. And it all took off from there because I looked at your extruders and the way that you bent them as they came out of the extrusions, and we had some fun with them. You have some pictures of them, Joyce, from the old days, and Bryan has a lot of memories because I, after Bryan came up to San Francisco State, maybe 10 years after I had first entered Mission Clay, he invited us over to the Fremont plant, Niles plant, and we had a weekend there, a clay retreat. There was about a dozen of us, I imagine, mostly graduate students. And Bryan was just on the cusp of graduating and becoming a graduate student on his own, but he was in charge of us to carry us through the weekend, and we had the time of our life at Bryan's invitation.
Do you remember that, Bryan?
I remember it well.
Right.
I remember it very well. In fact, Joyce, for a little, so I came up to San Francisco State as an undergraduate. I transferred from Southern California out of a junior college. And after being there a month or two or whatever it was, I meet Joe Hawley. And I've seen all these images of this amazing work that Joe has been doing with using clay extruded pipe. And he says to me, he says, you know, there's a factory over there in Fremont, right? And I go over there all the time and I pick stuff up. And I said, yeah, my family owns it. So the relationship grew quickly from there. And we did go over and we played for a weekend or two with the extrusions. Joe has a phenomenal sense of humor. And David Kuroka, who he has mentioned earlier, was a potter that was throwing these big, gigantic cylinders on Fridays, and he would leave them on the wheel spinning all weekend long so he could then blow them out into bigger forms. And Joe thought, gee, David takes up a lot of wheels with all this stuff, but you know, they're co-partners. So Joe goes over to Fremont, he grabs these big 4-inch cylinders, he brings them back on a Friday, sets them up on the wheel and gets all these things spinning all over the studio so David can't work. It was hilarious. It was terrific. It was really cool. So that was the beginning of our relationship with Joe. It since evolved over the years. Joe was a teacher, a mentor. Joe came down to Fremont and worked with us. We have this art and industry program that shifted to Phoenix, Arizona. And so Joe has come down and worked with us there. When he showed you that little cylinder that he had there on the table, he was doing these things that are 12 and 13 feet tall in Phoenix and stacking elements. Joe always has an amazing eye for elements. He would find these parts and these pieces, and he would build these things and compose these things. And we'd all stand back going, oh my God, how did you do that with these elements that he would find? And Joe had a very good friend in San Jose down at the time, and a man named Rick Sherman. And Rick Sherman said to me, he said, Bryan, Joe Hawley has more talent in his little finger than the art department of San Jose State. And that always stuck with me.
Please let me show you my little finger.
Unbelievably creative, unbelievably kind, warm, sharing individual. And it's been just fabulous working with Joe off and on through the years. I was coming up and doing a wine project and stopping in and seeing once in a while in the last 5 or 6 years. Haven't been up for a while, Joe, but I will. It'll happen.
Bring your wine.
Yes. But yeah, we've done a lot of work together, Joyce. It's been terrific.
You know, I'd like to add to that beyond the donut, but there's something I have to show you that sometimes takes me longer than most to realize what goes on. As you remember, back in the 60s, this was the time when you were awakened by stimulants of various kind. Now, one of the stimulants of my choice was beer. Now, at the time that I met Bryan, I happened to walk into the studio when he was showing off his skills from being a Southern California style potter. And he was sitting at wheel number 1 in the studio at San Francisco State. And I saw, oh, wow. And I had a ritual going on, habit actually, that I would sneak into the back refrigerator, get a beer, have it before class, my evening class, of course. And I grabbed two, and it happened to be a Henry Weinhardt. And so as walking through the lab, I took one of these tops and popped the top and set it on Brian's wheel. And I said, "Welcome to the Henry Weinhardt School of Art." And Brian loved that. I think he felt right at home.
I knew I transferred to the right school. Yeah.
Right. But an older story goes back even before then. It was when I was looking for alternatives to clay. Clay, now you got to be careful around Brian, because he's a guy with a bumper sticker that he invented and had printed, and it was on his truck. And it said, "Clay is the way." And I remember it, and I use it when I need it. And it's sort of a mantra that sets Mission Clay apart from the others. Clay is the way. Don't ever forget it. It is the motto of their industry, of their business. And yet I hadn't heard that yet. And I was an addict of clay. But around Marin County, where I was living in the 60s, around the base of the redwood trees and in the forest, you would see a little object that looked something like this, but it wiggled. It wiggled and it moved like slime in the forest. And so what I did is I was getting interested in glass, and I used that as sort of an idea. This is not one of mine. I found this later over in Mendocino at the Glassfire Studio. Buster, the glassblower and sculptor, so forth. He made this on the end of a pipe, and I had made several editions of it in clay. Now, what was important for me at that time was a title of an herb called Mary Jane. At least that was her feminine name. Other people had other names for it, but Mary Jane. When I took clay and put it on the wheel to make it look like this, and then said I can do more to it than that. I cut it in half, and they were about this big around. First one, a foot, and so forth. Very fat, luscious, and this was after Bob Strini had taught me. They introduced me to the spray gun to spray paint, and I was trying to get some rapport with lacquer, automotive lacquer, and so forth. But anyway, I cut this thing in half, and when you cut it in half, you kind of get a picture of one of these. It had that motion, the banana slug, and I called them Mary Jane's Turn. Mary Jane's Turn. You get it? Yeah, I got it. But the Mary Jane was the herb that I was experimenting with in the early 60s. And
did that lead to the wiggle?
Yes, that led to the wiggle. And the wiggle was fabricated from those turns like this, and then cut and stretched. And I did, and I sent it off to Syracuse and got in the Syracuse National Show with it, and felt very proud of myself. Oh my God, a museum accepted my wiggle. And so I did another one and sent it off to Davis. That was called Mary Jane's Turn again. Also painted clay, and it still sits over there in one of their cases, and it's probably been replicated or smoked probably. But it's legal now, and I don't have to be paranoid about it.
Did you start the Wiggle series with Bryan's company or somewhere else?
I started the Wiggle series at your company. That was by bringing home some turns, elbows, you call them, and had them sitting around the office there in San Francisco State, and trying to figure out what to do with them. And I had several of them cut. So if you take wiggle upon wiggle, pretty soon you have a rhythm, which is kind of like a sine wave, scientifically speaking. But on the other hand, it looked like a wiggle to me. It looked like a rhythm of sexuality, of course. And that was a rhythm that fascinated me for years. And I got that in a show, the first show of like a 10-foot wiggle, which I elevated on posts. And the first show I got into was the San Francisco Arts Festival, which I had always gone to as a viewer to see the famous artists of San Francisco from San Jose. I would drive up there with great expectations to see the sculpture in the show, and because Bill Wiley, Robert Hudson, Steve DeStabler, Manuel Neary, all the big Pete Volkus, all the big boys were in that show, and I would always see what was new this next year. And I was so proud of myself to get the wiggle in that show.
Yeah.
And
That's
it
outside
was,
the Civic Center?
that was in front of City Hall,
City Hall.
out there in the plaza there. Anyway, that's where the wiggle was invented, from mission clay and from cutting up turns. And thank you, Bryan, for your family business and letting me get
Wiggle.
involved with it.
Well, we have two wiggles, Joyce, in front of our office in Corona, California. We have two really long wiggles. They're fabulous. And Joe came down and we were making these bends and turns for him. If you remember, Joe, you're working with my son, Anthony.
Yes,
And
right.
we actually have some video of that. That was it. Not Lou, but who was the other man that was doing some filming?
Harvey.
Yeah. So I think I still have a CD of that.
Yeah.
You working at the factory, putting all these wiggles together. So Joyce, what would happen? It was Joe would put all these pieces together. They would have to fire them. And he was always introducing what I call elements, found objects. He had a very keen eye for everything. And one of the really fun parts of the wiggles at Mission Clay was the vision was, and it's not quite finished, Joe.
Right, I know it.
They have to visit. Do you remember what you were going to do with the symbol?
Well, the symbol, I did a test run up here of the symbol. The symbol, the whole idea of doing a sculpture garden down there was, I have to give Bryan's wife, Joy, the credit for putting that in Bryan's ear about doing a sculpture garden. And so many of the sculptors that had worked at the factory to make art, anyway, we're invited to make a piece and put it in the show. So I had made one wiggle before the Civic Center piece, and but Joy wanted two of them. Oh, okay. And they were kind of like having a conversation of sort. And your uncle came by one day, and I was trying to figure out a treatment to it, and I wasn't so hooked on glaze, and I was trying to find another treatment to that surface. And he says, "Well, what are you doing there?" And at that time there, I was covering the wiggles with camouflage tarps and things like this. The reason for that I gave your uncle for camouflaging them is that the wiggle has a sexuality. Now, believe it or not, it does. And the sexuality I felt was a little too blatant. So I told Owen, I said, "Owen, the reason I put the camouflage on it is to integrate it into the garden, so it won't be so blatantly sexual." and I left it there. And
Sure, you love that.
yeah, I'm sure he loved it too.
What more do you need to do with the garden there?
Well, as part of its identity to the garden was the animals around it, and the birds would come. Now, I one day got this flash of genius. Oh God, don't let me do that. I got a flash that day that wouldn't it be nice if we had a symbol, music choice, music, the symbol, ding. And if I just put a symbol on the top of the thing and then put birdseed in there every morning when Bryan and family would come to work, the garden would be singing in a percussive way.
That's cool.
By the birds feeding in the symbol plate, glued or put attached to the motion. And so I decided I bought, actually, man, I went to the extent up in Ukiah one day to look up a cymbal seller, music store.
Symbol seller.
And I bought a nice big 14, 15-inch cymbal bronze, spun out, and couldn't wait to get it back to my backyard here because we have lots of birds, and filling it with bird seed. And well, I did that, but the birds never came. And when they would come and eat the seed, and the sound wasn't coming through. So basically, my idea was a failure. It didn't.
We could probably still get it to work.
Well, you help me,
I
babe.
have that symbol somewhere.
Yes, I do. I picked it out of the garden.
Yeah.
You got to watch this one because she'll put things in the garden that are supposed to be on the top of a wiggle. But anyway, we
A wiggle stealer, huh? A wiggle stealer. So Joyce, we got these two beautiful wiggles down in Corona, Southern California. And then right next to the wiggle, we have this beautiful piece called Twister. And Joe came out to Phoenix. And I think you have some pictures of that, Joyce.
Yes, I do.
I'm on the forklift,
Mhm.
gouging this 2,000-pound piece of clay. And Joe goes, higher, right here, hit it right here, push right here. And then he has these tools on the pallet. As he sits on the pallet and he's scraping, and he's sort of it's like an orchestra. Joe is up there conducting with this gigantic piece that's slowly moving on this wheel, and he's scratching here and he's scratching there, and he's looking at this point. And of course, this thing is massive. It's gigantic. Well, we fired it, and yeah, just leave it outside. Thank you so much. Sorry. And so we fired it in Phoenix, and Joe was kind enough to share the piece with us, and it sits right next to the wiggles, and it's a marvelous, marvelous piece. We just love it, Joe. It's fabulous. And that was just a terrific trip down in Phoenix. It was one of
It was.
Yeah.
Is that the one that was at the Phoenix airport? That one?
That was the one no, we still have that one at the Phoenix airport. That one's almost 13 feet tall. That was gigantic. Yeah. And that's in pieces, and it's kind of in a box. So if you're ready for it, Jorn, we're happy to send it up. If you want to help your dad put this together, it's about 15.
I got some other elements to go to it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got about 1,500 pounds of materials to this piece. But yeah, that was at the airport. That was the airport for a couple of years. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, I would like to say something. In 2009, Joe exhibited AZ Twister in our local sculpture trail. And I remember that extremely well, Joe. It was well received.
Well, thank you.
Is that the same piece?
No,
Or this is
I
the one that's
made
in there, right?
several of them that one afternoon. At least got them started, and Bryan helped me and bared with me about keeping. He would bring wet, 2,000-pound cylinders of clay to this what he calls potter's wheel on steroids. A big turntable about 3 foot in diameter, and we would set this 2,000-pound piece of clay on it and turn it slowly and this is on a forklift. The forklift was our turning device, and Bryan was operating it, making sure not to tip it over on me, who was trying to direct it from in the face. You know, this is almost like a Hemingway story. You know, he was not afraid to deal with the fierceness of a bull. Well, Bryan taught me how to not be afraid of the fierceness of the forklift, because he raised the blades as it turned slowly to make these scores that flailed the clay off. I mean, some of it, now the piece I have here, one of them, the clay flails off of them in motion, which totally surprised us. I mean, we didn't know how much power a forklift had about carving into the clay. This wasn't a little trimming tool. This was the real deal. But anyway, I when I got off the fork, I mean, I faced Bryan after the piece was dealt with. I said, Bryan, Pete Volkes would have been proud of us.
Absolutely.
He would have been. Peter's our mentor of dealing big clay, and that was a reference to seeking his wisdom and remembering him and for what he did. I'm gonna rest my
I have a question.
question.
Where did the stacked spheres and the smaller stacked extruded sculptures that ended up being big sculptures come from, and also the whistling columns and all that?
Columns.
The
The columns are basically a guy thing. If you will excuse me, this is kind of where the column come from, and I think every guy who ever worked at Mission Clay or any other extruded piece recognizes the virility of this particular image. That's probably where it came from. That is where it came from.
But where did you do the stacked sphere? for
Oh,
instance?
this stacked sphere. Oh,
The stacked spheres and the other, extruded, the smaller extrusions that ended up being big sculptures.
well, it had to do with the size of the extruder, because the first extruder was this size. It's a little hand extruder. You would nail it or bolt it to the wall, and as it's made out of a pipe and with a hole in it and a plug in the center, so it comes out like a hollow pipe. And we bought one for the school. Al, who had an extruder company down near Santa Cruz, survived for
Al Johnson.
Al Johnson, right. And so his extruder was very popular in ceramic labs. You just put a plug of clay in there and pull on it, and out would come these things like this. I call them a thing. My parents taught me to call things like this a thing, because you can't really say what that thing is without being rude.
But you got square ones too, right?
Well,
Square ones? No.
I don't know. I've never seen a square one.
So Joyce, one of the things that Joe has been spectacular at doing, as I previously mentioned, is he's a composer. He really is. And he composes and puts these things together. And the rest of us kind of look at the object initially, the element, what Joe would call an element, and we go, okay, what are you going to do with this, Joe? So I think maybe what Jordan's referring to is Joe was also going down to Fremont a little bit before Mission Clay and working at Craft Tile. And Craft Tile was extruding these square tiles. They're hollow tiles. And basically the way it worked is there was a tile on top, there was a tile on the bottom, and there's these supports in the middle. and the wires were cutting this as it's extruding wet. They would fire it in that form, like this rectangle, and then they would hit it with a hammer, and the middle parts would pop out, and you'd have a straight tile on the top and a straight tile on the bottom. It was wonderful. So Joe's idea was to go to Craft Tile, and Joe was very good at somehow convincing us managers of factories that this was a great thing to do. And he said, take the knives out. I don't want the knives because I want those middle sections. But I want to extrude pallets and pallets and pallets of these things, which he did. Then he put them on a wheel and he cut them all round. And so now this square tile, that's a floor tile, purpose-wise, has now become what he called a cockroach hotel. These are Joe's terms.
I haven't heard that.
He would stack these things up in these tall columns. Is this one of the things you're thinking about, Jordan?
Yeah, exactly. The whistling
Yeah.
columns. Yeah.
They're gorgeous. They are so beautiful. And at the very bottom, there's this little opening that he cuts at this diagonal. So there's actually an opportunity for others to inhabit that space, to work in there. And they're really, really gorgeous sculptures. And they were very totem, very column-like-esque. And quite, they were amazing pieces, Joe.
Well, I have to admit I got they brought me over to Hawaii. Suzanne Wolf brought me over for the large scale ceramic symposium at the university there, and so I had Craft Tile put a ton of them on the boat. I had them put them on pallets, wrapped them in plastic, put them on the Matson lines, and they shipped them to Honolulu for this clay, large-scale ceramic summer that we were going to do. There was a number of us that were invited, and I was lucky to have sent those elements because I had stacks of them, a ton of mud, and they'd never seen clay. Is a little more hard to get in Hawaii than it is on the mainland here at the foot of the Sierras. But so I started stacking some of them. I first laid out an 8 by 8 foot grid of them, and I'll have to tell you a little story. I have parts of that grid here that I've carved into and so forth. And it was sort of like writing a love letter to this little wahine that I had met, very talented woman. And I did some symbols on the front of it, but on and on. It was an unsuccessful relationship. So I'll go back to the hollow core tile idea, and I did another piece just using stacks of them. I made about an 8 foot cylinder, a column out of it, and put it in the Hawaii Craftsman exhibition there. And they said, "Oh, you can't. That's illegal. You can only there's a 6 foot maximum in this to get in this show." And I said, "Well, I tell you what, I'll put 6 foot of it in there, and then when the show's over, I'll add the other 2 feet." And we did that. And so I got snuck in not snuck in. They invited me back after the show was up for its month, and I completed the piece for the Honolulu Academy of the Arts. That's right in Honolulu, and it stayed there it's still there. It's still there. They purchased it, and I feel good that it has a good home. They actually purchased it because it was too expensive to ship back. I'll be honest on that. Okay, I'll open it up to you again, Bryan. Thank you for. I did another little series off of that hollow core tile One of them is in my backyard here in Cloverdale. It's called a stacked column, a stacked sphere. And I did it up at another factory I worked with, Gliding McBean. I'm not supposed to. Well, anyway, Gliding McBean is a big clay factory here in California that, no. I had this tile sent over from a craft tile company in Fremont. And anyway, that was part of it. Then when I got up to Gliding, the other factory, I'm losing it. I had them stack me up a ton of it, and then I started cutting a sphere out of it, a sphere out of these hollow core tiles, and that's what I have here in the backyard, unglazed, but it has a sort of a natural clay finish to it, and it's porous, and so the moisture, the moisture that gets into it feeds life, and the trees have put its magic to it, and moss has jumped from the trees, the living trees, to the porous clay, and it's amazing second life to this material.
Did you do the smaller spheres at the same time?
I did them as a prototype out of this hand extruder.
Yeah.
And then from the hand extruder, I said, oh, I could do a big
one, yeah.
So the big one down here weighs a little more than a ton and is about 4 foot in diameter.
And the smaller ones are the ones that you had in
the smaller one, right? Was the piece that I gave you, Joyce, for the Cloverdale show. That is it's a partial sphere. Fragment of the forgotten ancestor. It's kind of when I was starting to change from clay as a utilitarian object to a spatial concept. And I read somewhere, or probably found it on TV, that life out there may have been the predecessor to us people, life itself. And I'm still interested in finding out more about that. If you hear about it, let me know. I mean, they have some amazing things happening in space, and most of them get through to my feeble mind through TV and my daughter. I'll say something in a conversation to her, and she'll go to her computer and reach out with that and come back, oh, you mean this? And yes, and she introduced me to
colliding black holes.
Colliding black holes, which were concepts like this that get together, two feminine images out in space that we are getting signs of, because when two feminine images in space get together in a collision, there's a vibration that after 50 billion years, sun is still manufacturing itself through the universe. We're picking it up with technology, how they do that, and I don't know, but they've got some wizards out there, and when that kind of thing happens,
we want to hear about it.
we want to hear about it. Very good. God, I'm glad my daughter's here with me.
Hey, Joyce, Joe and Joyce, one of the things when Joe talks about spatial integration and spatial awareness, when you move from utilitarian, which is a little bit more, the idea of function is very obvious, right? It's a cup, it's a bowl, it's a plate. We use it. It's beautiful. It's gorgeous. It's part of what we do. It's an interactive thing that we do every day. But when you take it to the next step, form and scale becomes really amazingly important. And Joe recognized that. And I think Joe was one of the first and probably one of the most successful artists that realizes that he needed scale, to understand and to keep challenging this spatial relationship between him and his work and his ideas. And so he went to industry. Industry was the only group that could do this for him. And so Joe Hawley was the guy that figured out, if I can incorporate people with bigger toys than school, right? We get some really big toys, Joyce, I'm telling you. We're extruding pipe today in Phoenix, Arizona, and each piece of clay weighs 2 tons. One piece of pipe, right? It's magnificent. It comes out of the ceiling. It's that spatial thing you're looking for, Joe, out in space. We're doing it right now in Phoenix. It's coming down to earth from this gigantic extruder. But Joe realized by reaching out to industry, that's how he could push this curiosity and this interest that he had in dealing with this form and space larger than this tabletop thing, which is what most ceramic artists are used to, right? We work on a tabletop, we work on a pallet, we work on a desk, whatever that is, or a wheel. And Joe took it to the industrial level and did it magnificently. He talked about Gladiator McBean earlier, which is a really good company up in the Bay Area. They're up outside of Sacramento. Perhaps you've heard of them, Joyce. And they've had craftsmen and artists in there for 150 years doing stuff. All the big friezes and facades in the buildings in downtown San Francisco were all done by Gladiator McBean artists. And so they really have a really rich history. Joe tapped into that. Then Joe tapped into craft tile. Then Joe tapped into Mission Clay. Then Joe tapped into building products down in Phoenix. And if there was more tapping to do, he'd be doing it, I guarantee you. But he really has been extraordinary in realizing his vision and his ideas and in collaborating with industry. Industry is not very receptive to artists. Gladiator McBean closed their art program down years ago because they just don't want to deal with artists anymore.
Brian, that's because we never clean up properly.
Well, and they have really funny hours. This idea of 7 to 3:30 just doesn't work in the art world. Yeah, it just doesn't work. And but Joe's been magnificent in tapping into all that. Joe once in a while will call me and he'll have this epiphany. And he'll say, BVZ, I got to talk to you. And he'll share this idea for me. I'll call him back 3 weeks later. The idea is not quite as clear, but it was there initially. And I said, Joe, we should follow through with this. Let's see if we can't make this happen. And so he's actually been down to Phoenix also, trying to work on some very, very unique ideas, things that are, Joe's always been about collaboration. He's always been about people. He wants that interaction. He loves them. I'm sure Alan Capro and all the happenings that Alan was doing in the 60s were something that Joe could really identify with, because it's the idea of bringing people together, collaborative. All the students at San Francisco State, which is where I met Joe, when I run into them at various events, the first person they ask me about is Joe Hawley. It's really true, Joe.
Thank you. I'm glad they do.
Michelle Gregors of the world and all these people that just revered Joe as an instructor, because Joe didn't go by the playbook. Joe didn't have a playbook. And so he allowed you to be creative. He allowed you to come up with new ideas. Joe's the first guy to stick his head in a slip bucket and come out with slip all over him. And the rest of the faculty would go, what is Hawley doing down there in the ceramic department? And the students absolutely loved it. They learned so much. They were so energized. He has been a real beacon. He really has.
Well, thank you, Brian. I like the thought that you give from others, and some of these things that I showed you here were secrets hidden in my underwear, but I didn't have to take my pants off to show you. So I'm going to put these aside and get on to the other things that we might do, and I'll think of them later. I can't do too much at one time. It stretches my skull and taxes my sensibility. You can't think about it too much. It has to happen like an improvisation, like a hunch. Like, I'm proud of some of the things that I did. I used to hang out at a place called the Beach Chalet, 1000 the Great Highway in San Francisco, just down from the old Cliff House. And there used to be a place there called Playland. It was an amusement park. And I got, after school, I would go to the beach chalet and have a couple of brainstorms with somebody from the film department called Lou Lopez, and bring Bryan and bring some of the workers from school there. The place was filled with WPA murals from the 30s. I had more important things to say at the beach chalet than I ever had to say in a clay lab, because it just comes to you after work and over a they made their own beer there. They didn't have to go to Henry Weinhardt, but we had a good time there, Bryan.
Yes, we did.
The many after I even talked the faculty into having a faculty meeting there once, and they thanked me for it, because nobody thanks another person for having a faculty meeting. But if you have it at the beach chalet, one of the guys in our faculty, Ralph Butzker, helped on that mural. It was Fresco, and it was originally designed by Lucien Lebeau back in 1938, when San Francisco was being coming out of their shell, and Lucien was doing a portrait of the Bay Area. And I have to admit that Lou and I would sit there at the bar and hold fests of imagination to the best looking girl at the bar about who that was and who that was. And we would tell little fibs, not lies, about who that person, sometimes we were right, about who that person in that mural was, and who Lucian's wife was, and where his girlfriend was down near the men's room. But the stories went on, and it was a thread that went through my professional life in San Francisco, at least, because it was there. I felt really proud of finding that place on a Sunday, Easter Sunday, 1968, with my wife, Sam, Sharon's mom, and we were driving back from the lab at school. I had to go over and check the kiln, and then back to Marin. I was driving up the Great Highway, and I see a flashing beer sign in the window, neon, and it drew me to it. And I went in to see if it was really open, because it was an official looking building and columns in front and acres of parking. So out in front of that beach chalet is the Great Highway, and in front of that acres of parking, and there's a great Pacific Ocean. And so the going there at sunset was a total treat. So 15 years, I'll back up to that moment. I couldn't wait till Monday to call Lou. We'd been looking for the right pub for the after hours sessions for San Francisco State. Some of the San Francisco State people knew about it. Some of them even worked on them, but I found out about it and had to adopt it as the official art department place, because the murals, the history of San Francisco, the Great Pacific Ocean at sunset couldn't fail. And it gave me 15 years of good pleasure before they closed it. The vets who had managed it couldn't come up with the money to keep the building up. And so they gave up the lease, and it stayed dormant for 15 years before a San Francisco State graduate got an idea for his BFA thesis. And it was a case study, and he went and he drew up a plan to reconstitute the murals downstairs, because the vets were trying to clean them with Ajax, I think, and they were wiping out the mural, and it was like bad deal. So anyway, I'm Gar, the business student from state did a case study about, he would put a brewery up top and he would reconstitute the murals, put a new roof on. You know, we're talking about a business plan that took several $1,000,000 to accomplish, but with acres of parking out front, he made it happen. And they reopened the Beach Chalet to a fantastic success that they had to put an addition onto it and then go over in Oakland on Lake Merritt and build another one similar. It was called the Lake Merritt Chalet, you know. And anyway, enough Chalet. We had several events out front in
Pit fires, right? Or
we had
fires?
pit fires down the beach closer to San Francisco State, which were firing on the beach. Another way, you would call it a beach party in most language, but we would call it a raku firing. And David was definitely involved with taking and Mel Henderson the space and using it for the students, with the students
On the beach.
on the
right?
beach.
Like an overnight or weekend kind of thing.
Mostly it was close enough to school that you could do it after school or one in the night.
Did they allow you to do that on Ocean Beach, or is that
Yes,
just- yeah, really?
yeah. To begin with, the thing, we would have firings at the beach, like pit firings and raku firings, and we built kilns that could be toted around. And then when we started to hang in with the sculpture people, Mel Henderson was over there building out in the sand dunes artificial lakes and dealing with other elements, the winds, and they were jumping off the cliffs with their
Oh my God.
homemade parasails and things like that.
Were they burning effigies, like kind of a Burning Man type thing too?
We were doing, the images would come up, images such as trying to fly. And there was also, we did some things, we paralleled it in other places in between Santa Cruz and San Francisco, like Waddell Creek. And David was still down in San Jose State finishing his degree. And when David, who I had known from City College years earlier, said, well, I'll bring some kids up, let's get together. And we did that on the beach in Waddell Creek, and then later Pescadero. And the famous full moon raccoons were weekend events, and they went on. It grew with the social hunger that we had for each other and sharing ideas. The raku is definitely a thing that put San Francisco State in a social place. Did you ever hear about it in Southern California, Brian?
No, I was there at Pescadero, Joe.
Well, I
So,
know. I know
yeah.
you were later, but
Not previously.
when you were in Southern California, did you hear about the raccoons up there?
I had not. However, Joyce, I found San Francisco State by seeing all this amazing raku and pit fire they were doing. I actually was in a car driving up looking for a school to transfer to, and I stopped in one morning to see David Middlebrook at San Jose State. And David Middlebrook showed me around and said, come work with us. It's a great school, blah, 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 which it is. And then I went up to San Francisco State and met the students, and I ran into David. Joe wasn't there that day, but I saw all the work they were doing. And that was the allure for me, Joe, was all that amazing raku and pit fire work was something I had not seen before. It was very impressive.
You
Yeah.
know, Brian, my first memory of you is when you and Joy, and I think David came up to our property in Annapolis. When
I
I was
remember.
a kid, I must have been like 8 or something. And you guys were doing a big pit fire in our meadow, on our
Yes.
property there.
I remember it vividly. And your mom made tofu lasagna, and I'd never had tofu in my life. So I'm looking for the meatballs, and there weren't any meatballs. I remember that really well, Jorn. Yeah, really well.
Well, you come visit us, and you won't be able to do a pit fire in our meadow, but I'll make you a tofu lasagna.
I would love it. I would love it. I would love it. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, Brian, do you have any last thoughts, memories, things would you like to say before we end this session? I found this just the most fun I've had in a long time. And I'm so glad
Us
that
too,
Yeah,
Joyce.
me too.
Thank you.
so, Brian, do you have anything to add?
Not that I can think of, but yeah, we can continue on. And the next thing, I think this kind of segues nicely into what's happening now and here on the property, and
Yes.
you know, how the sculptures are growing moss, you know. So
Joyce, I want to say one more little thing. The other day, in having a conversation with Brian, when we, which isn't on the computer, but we were talking about scale, and Brian re-mentioned scale here today, but he told me about a project that he's doing at the factory right now that dealt with these huge pieces of 3-foot diameter pipe that he's doing for a winery project down there in Temecula. Now, he's already broken the ice up here in Sonoma County by doing a project with Fetzer in Hopland in their wine caves, and he did these terracotta pieces, and they Jordan went and got a couple of bottles. Now, these are
Saracena, not Fetzer.
Serafina, yeah, is the name of the wine. It's a
Great.
it is Fetzer that came about, but she brought this bottle out, and Brian is making big cylinders out of terracotta and firing them, and they're curing the wine in them, and as the Romans did
Yeah, can we hear about that?
thousands a year ago.
Because I heard something about this crazy scale that you're working on, Brian, about removing the spent wine. That was just the numbers didn't even stick in my head, but I know you've got some crazy ceramic wine projects that I'd be interested in.
Yeah, what's in Temecula, and it's a little bit about 7,000 feet, which is a little over a mile, of these big pipes that we make, Joyce, and that's for wineries. And basically, we put in what they call the trunk line, and then all the wineries will build around this trunk line, and everything that's the discharge from the wine process, which is extremely acidic, gets dumped into these big clay line that we're introducing to the area. So yeah, it's part of the industrial part of what we do. And we have an artist down there right now carving on one of these big pipes, and she's really having a blast. But as far as finishing up, Joyce, you know, Joe is just a marvelous man. Everybody that knows Joe walks away thinking what an amazing human being that Joe is. He gives, he shares, he loves. He has just the most gentle, wonderful soul. And to go back to what Rick Sherman said, more talent in his little finger than the whole art department. And I think that really, really resonated and has with me forever. Yes. Thank you, Joe. So Joyce, thank you for having me.
I'm glad you could join us.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. Good to see you, brother.
Thank you,
Oh,
Joe.
thank
Love you,
you,
Joe.
everybody.
Jordan.
This
Yeah.
was very, very enjoyable. And this video will be up at our website on the 24th, which is International Day, along
Great.
with other conversations and collateral material. And do take a look at it. And thank you again. And I hope I get to see you again, Brian.
Thank you, Joyce. So I look forward to when I come visit. Maybe we can catch up and say hi.
That would be great. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye, Brian. See ya.